In Buddhism's view of the world and the universe, there is no God. Buddhism teaches that one is responsible for his or herself and is ultimately in control of their own life and destiny, rather than being subject to outside influence from a power which governs in a way which we ourselves might not.
Every human being wants happiness. And Buddha, he acts like a teacher. You are your own master. Future, everything depends on your own shoulder. Buddha's responsibility is just to show the path. That's all.
Contemplation about such things as the origins of man and the universe are irrelevant and are seen as just another obstacle along the path to enlightenment, which is Buddhism's main concern. Although Buddhism does not have a specific teaching about the origin of the universe or man, it more or less looks to popular modern science for the answer to this question.
Big Bang theory. We Buddhists very easily sort of accept that. And then, from Buddhist viewpoint, not only one Big Bang, the previous endless Big Bang must be there. Otherwise, why is one Big Bang happen? Why? There must be causes and conditions. So that create previous Big Bang, like that. So that's very, very fit the Buddhist sort of cosmology. Endless world. World appear, disappear, appear, disappear, go like that.
The Buddhist view of life and death has cycles of life, death, and rebirth called reincarnation. Since modern atheistic views of cosmology tell us about the birth, death, and rebirth of stars and the universe, the Buddhist has little or no difficulty accepting the Big Bang theory as being true. From the Buddhist viewpoint, reincarnation is a necessary process along the path to enlightenment and liberation. Although many in the West accept reincarnation, few understand it as the Buddhist does. Because the Buddhist believes in reincarnation, it is quite easy for him or her to then picture themselves as once being an insect or an animal, and then gradually being reborn at some future point as a human. Reincarnation is seen as a negative event. Theoretically, the cyclic existence from one life to the next, or samsara, continues forever unless the being, or person, we might easier say, experiences a liberation from reincarnation by becoming enlightened. And so then we must ask, what is enlightenment? Enlightenment can be summed up as attaining to the knowledge and wisdom of the hidden truth about the nature of reality. The truth which one gradually discovers is that there is no self, but only an interconnected force of energy and a consciousness shared by all beings. In other words, you do not have a separate and individual self-identity. The concept that there is no self is what the enlightenment of Buddhism really amounts to in its most simple form. To the Buddhist mind, as long as one desires the things found in the birth and rebirth existence, known as samsara, that is exactly where he or she will remain to experience suffering and dissatisfaction. This is why the idea of oneness, or no self, is absolutely necessary for Buddhist thought, because the idea of an eternal self who exists forever in an afterlife would be completely contrary to the final goal of Buddhism, which is a liberation from conscious existence. In Buddhist thought, your perception of yourself as being a separate and distinct person among many separate and distinct people would be a false perception, or a delusion about reality. This type of delusion keeps a person trapped in the cycle of reincarnation. Since from the Buddhist perspective, suffering and dissatisfaction occur through birth, life, death, and rebirth, the Buddhist then wants to be liberated or set free from that cycle. This liberation or escape from consciousness and awareness into no consciousness and no awareness is therefore the final goal of Buddhism, and is brought about by the enlightenment of realizing that you are not separate from everything and everyone else. This liberation from birth and rebirth is called nirvana. Nirvana is not a place. It also is not a 1990s alternative rock band, or even a state of mind, but rather it is a state of existence. Enlightenment, on the other hand, or a realization of Buddhism's view of reality, is the pathway which leads to that state of existence known as nirvana. It is taught that when one reaches nirvana, he or she returns back to the purest form of energy from which they came, and they are therefore everywhere and in everything, but with no consciousness, no awareness, and no individual identity or thought. In other words, in nirvana, it could be easily said that you effectively cease to exist, at least in a conscious and aware state. Nirvana is kind of like looking at an empty glass and seeing that even though the glass is empty, there is nothing missing from the glass. This is how the Buddhist views himself. He is an empty vessel with nothing inside. No soul, no identity, no self. He is only a body composed of energy and animated by chemical reactions. To help you understand nirvana, let me put forth a thought. Imagine that you are traveling in outer space. Suddenly, you encounter a black hole. As you enter the gravitational pull of the black hole, it crushes you and your spaceship like an empty soda can under somebody's foot. The matter which composes your body would continue to be compressed even after your death had occurred, while your mass and that of the spacecraft and anything else in the black hole would all become super heavy and super hot. At this point, you have more or less become part of the black hole and everything in it. Comparatively, nirvana also is a state of being and yet not being. It is a state of existing and yet not existing as an individual. Nirvana is a disappearance of any trace of self, and is instead a complete union with all things, just as the matter of your body and the spaceship would achieve union with all the matter in the black hole and the black hole itself. This state of nirvana is the final goal of the Buddhist. For many people, this concept of oneness or no self taught within Buddhism can be a bit confusing. So I would like to use the following movie clips to help illustrate the points which Buddhism teaches on oneness and no self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon?
Then you'll see that it is not the spoon that bends, it is only yourself.
Check him. He's gone.
Now get up.
He is the one.
When one talks about Buddhism, it is important to understand the concept of karma. The Buddhist view about karma teaches that if you do something like feed a hungry person, or comfort them, or give charitably to their well-being, you can then accumulate positive karma, which is like a form of spiritual credit. Also, there goes with this the concept of negative karma. Negative karma is accumulated when you kill someone, or steal, or commit some negative or evil act. Another way to think of karma is to view it as a farmer at a local grain elevator. If enough grain was produced by the farmer to cover his expenses for fixing his equipment, ordering seeds, paying hired drivers, and also making a profit for himself, we could compare this to the Buddhist having had accumulated enough positive karma through his acts of kindness and compassion in order that he might have a better reincarnation and progress further along his spiritual path to the liberation from samsara, just as the farmer would be better off in his next season of planting because of the effort he had put forth. The opposite is also true. Let's imagine that the farmer was lazy or spent his money in an unwise manner. If the farmer's yield at harvest time does not offset his expenses, then he will have lost money, not gained. This would mean that his next season of planting would be very difficult. He may even lose everything which he had worked so hard to gain, and might also have to sell his home and land just to pay his debts. And eventually, he might end up living somewhere else because he was not able to improve his situation. This is comparable to the person who cares only for his or herself and acts selfishly or with hatred and malice towards others. Once that person dies, it is taught that if with their actions they had accumulated more negative karma than positive karma, they will be reborn as a poor person, a deformed person, or perhaps mentally retarded, or an abused child or adult, or possibly even be carried back to a state of existence wherein they are once again an insect or an animal, and this would set them farther back in their journey towards liberation or nirvana. This is why it is so very important for the Buddhist to show compassion to others and do as much good as he or she is able to do. In Buddhism, there is also a big emphasis on detachment from the desires and cravings of the world, because those cravings bring suffering and dissatisfaction when we don't experience what we want. This disappointment keeps us in a state of seeking the next experience of pleasure or happiness, while experiencing feelings of loss when the short-lived pleasure is over or missed. It is taught that this cycle of craving or desiring something, then receiving it, or in some cases not receiving it, then losing it again, and becoming dissatisfied with that cycle, is what keeps us all imprisoned in birth and rebirth. Because of this attachment to desires and wants, the Buddhist must cultivate a detachment from those things so that he or she can be liberated from birth and rebirth. In Buddhism, there is also a big emphasis on meditation because of the influence of the New Age movement and Eastern religions like Buddhism in Western society. The word meditate, as many people understand it today, has nothing to do with thinking critically and examining and analyzing something, as it once did, but has come to mean to train the mind, or to be empty, in the sense of clearing the mind and waiting for an enlightened thought to enter spontaneously. Meditation within Buddhism is one of the key components of training a person to better understand Buddhist teaching and thoughts. In fact, it might be said that without meditation there is no Buddhism, because meditation plays a central role in helping the Buddhist to train his mind to accept and observe the Buddhist teaching that there is no self and no permanent identity. The person who is seeking Buddhism as a spiritual discipline to govern their life will often learn meditation techniques with a meditation instructor. The purpose of the meditation instructor is to help the person free their mind and realize that they can be one with all things. Again, we look to Hollywood for an example of this concept seen in film.
What's happening here?
My hand. You see the strength of my son's DNA combined with nanomed reconstruction? You see, I can partake with the essences of all things.
I'll have to ask you to put your hands up, pal, okay? Nice and easy.
Do you really believe that I am separate from you?
Meditation can take many forms. For example, a person might be instructed by their meditation guide to close their eyes and focus on their own breathing. The person might also be told to picture an object in their mind and contemplate how it has a certain form and shape, but has no identity. They would then picture the person who might have fashioned the object, and consider how many hands were involved in producing the same object, whatever it might be. This would serve to help the person understand how we are all interconnected, even at the most simple and fundamental levels within daily life, and therefore within existence as a whole. This would then show the person meditating that we really are all one, with all things and with each other. Through this visualization technique, thoughts and feelings of tranquility and peacefulness replace thoughts and feelings of apprehension or uncertainty, which might occur when one begins to receive the more straightforward teachings about the Buddhist view of the nature of reality and no self. Sometimes, this visualization might be accompanied with chanting a mantra, which simply means to repeat a word or phrase or key teaching which concerns itself with Buddhist concepts. These visualizations might also be accompanied with an instruction to contemplate some mystery of Buddhism's teaching on a certain issue. All of these things are the most basic beliefs and practices of Buddhism. Let's now examine how these beliefs might affect our interactions with other people. Because Buddhism teaches that when you do something good, good fortune comes back to you, or when you do something bad will happen to you, Buddhism actually seems to be a religion which is lacking true compassion and replacing it with something which seems to be mechanical and practiced and based upon a reward system. As an example, if you have a child who is born deaf, deformed, or mentally retarded, or is bullied at school by his peers, Buddhism would teach that this is his karma being repaid to him from a former life because of some evil thing which he must have done. In other words, he actually deserves this treatment because he did something bad in a former life. This means that if a woman is raped or abused by a stranger or even a boyfriend or her husband, that this is her karma being repaid to her because she may have been the very same type of man in her former life who is currently abusing her in this life. I have a big problem with blaming a child for his own abuse by others or his misfortune to have been born blind or disabled in some way, or blaming a woman for her own rape and abuse at the hands of an evil man. Jonathan Landau, Stephen Bodian, and Professor Gundren Buneman give us the following insight into this Buddhist teaching in their co-authored book, Buddhism for Dummies.
A tremendous amount of time may pass between your action, cheating someone, and the reaction you experience, someone cheating you. The same idea is also true for positive actions. The results may take a long time to show up. Even though some karmic effects ripen rather quickly, you don't experience most of the outcomes for one or more lifetimes.
Because Buddhism is like many other religions in the sense that it constantly challenges the follower of its teachings to be a better person in the hopes of getting some sort of reward, it becomes impossible to know when the Buddhist has finally done enough good to reach that state of reward.
It's a common belief in South Asian religions that virtuous actions, such as the practice of generosity, create a store of positive energy, or merit. This meritorious energy brings about positive results in the future, in accordance with the karmic law of cause and effect.
Also, as Buddhism teaches that there is no self, some very interesting paradoxes begin to arise as a result. Though Buddhists themselves have struggled with the same questions which I am about to present, the debates continue and the explanations vary even to this day. The following is a short list of these questions. If there is no individual, then who is being reincarnated? To whom is good or bad karma credited? Who is murdered? And who is the murderer if we are all one? If I kill someone, how can I be guilty since I am not even an individual? If anyone has achieved nirvana, how can that possibly be verified since that person would then vanish and become one with all things and has more or less disappeared into everything and everyone everywhere in an unseen and immeasurable event? The question then also becomes, what is the person who has reached nirvana not a part of? Or, what is not a part of that person who we thought existed, since they are now one with all things? If each person in existence is one with all things, then you are one with Hitler, or a child molester, or a rapist, as well as your coffee table or a rock in your backyard. This then begs a final and strange question. Do I really exist? Or did a person ever exist if they never had an individual or personal identity? The interpretation of these questions is more or less left to the individual to decide for his or herself, though Landau, Bodian, and Professor Buneman offer an explanation to oneness and no self for us to consider.
The great Zen masters inevitably teach that the mind includes all of reality, with nothing left out. This very body is the Buddha's body, this very mind is the Buddha's mind, and this very moment is inherently complete and perfect just the way it is.
Nothing needs to be changed or added to make this body, mind, and moments more spiritual or holy than it already is. You merely need to awaken to the non-dual nature of reality for yourself. Though some may see the materialistic attitudes of Westerners as a common aspect of modern life, Buddhism sees consumerism and the acquisition of goods and services as a bad thing, because it cannot provide an end to craving and desires of things, but rather increases these cravings and desires, and therefore keeps one locked into the samsara existence of birth and rebirth. This is why the Buddhist strives for emptiness of the mind during meditation, and a detachment from desiring the world and the things of the world. The point of meditation is to destroy the natural sense, which we all are born with, of being an individual with an individual identity. Even Buddhism admits that we all have a naturally occurring sense of self, and this is the entire reason that the Buddhist teachings on no self even exist in the first instance. As strange as it may seem to the average Westerner, some people have bought into the teaching of no self to the point where they are not even sure that they exist anymore. I came across this webpage wherein someone was actually struggling with knowing whether or not they actually existed. To me, it's quite shocking and sad that someone could actually question their own existence. If a person did not exist, how then could they possibly wonder if they do exist? In this sense, Buddhism seems to cause more confusion about the nature of reality for the follower of its teachings rather than providing any clear answers. In times of war, most soldiers had a problem with beating women and children and killing them and burning their villages as an emperor was expanding his territory. So it was necessary to use the no-self and karma teachings of Buddhism to then convince the soldiers that these people don't really exist and they deserve what they are getting because of their karma. According to some Buddhist traditions, it is impossible to achieve enlightenment about the reality and liberation from suffering in only one lifetime. As a result, I have to conclude that it would be also impossible to measure whether anyone, including the founder of Buddhism, has ever reached that state of existence. Again, we turn to Landau Bodian and Professor Buneman for some insights into this topic.
Many Buddhists believe that it took Shakyamuni Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, many lifetimes from the time he first turned his mind toward the spiritual path to the time he achieved full and complete enlightenment, so experiencing instant results isn't realistic.
Another issue that seems to be of concern within Buddhist thought is the teaching about detachment and how this causes the Buddhist to relate to others. In Buddhism, one must be detached from the world and the things of the world to maintain a proper balance of karma and hopefully avoid birth and rebirth someday. Detachment carries with it the need to be emotionally detached from people, as well as detached from certain situations and material things. This actually means that a person cannot really love another so much as they can have compassion on them. In this sense, love must be replaced with compassion so that you do not have an attachment to a person who can hurt you or be taken from you. This disappointment would keep you imprisoned in the samsara existence of birth and rebirth. As a result, the Buddhist must be emotionally detached from others. The sad truth of this is seen at a question and answer session given by the Dalai Lama, who is in terms of his importance within Buddhism comparable to the importance of the Pope within the Catholic Church.
Hi, salutation to you, His Holiness. I want to ask you, since you are the most loved person, what is your definition of love?
Definition of love. Love often goes with attachment. Now, for example, love one's own family member or wife or husband, like that. That compassion, sense of affection is biased, limited, and must depend on others' behavior. And also, you see, the reason, my loved one, my friend, like that.
Concerning suffering and detachment, Landau, Bodian, and Buneman give us some Buddhist insight on the issue.
By clinging to this false sense of self, you not only set yourself up for disappointment and suffering as you go through this life, but you also condemn yourself to wander endlessly from one unsatisfactory life to the next.
Because suffering comes from desirous attachment or craving, eliminating craving leads to an end of all suffering. Although there is no doubt that Buddhism does stress a certain level of moral conduct in terms of doing good to others, many topics concerning morality are left up to the individual to decide. If at any time a Buddhist wanted to go back to a life wherein they do whatever they might want to do, that would be perfectly fine. That person will just remain in the samsara cycle of birth and rebirth until they might like to seek enlightenment once again, because in Buddhist thought, there is no eternal punishment to fear, and lasting peace and happiness is achieved by having a particular mindset, rather than having sins forgiven, as the monotheistic religions would teach.
Ultimately, you're responsible for how you live your life. In Buddhism, no guru or god watches over you, prepared to hand out punishment if you stray from the path.
In contrast to the monotheistic religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which teach that man's most fundamental nature is that he is evil and selfish, and that man is rejected by God because man's eternal being is marked or stained by evil deeds called sin. Buddhism teaches that man in his truest sense is actually good and pure, as Landau, Bodian, and Buneman suggest.
With the Master's guidance, the disciple wakes up and realizes that he isn't this limited separate self, but is rather pure, vast, mysterious, ungraspable consciousness itself, also known as the Buddha nature or big mind. In other words, your fundamental nature needs no polishing through spiritual practice because it's never been stained, even for an instant.
Though Landau, Bodian, and Buneman make the assertion that man is good and pure at his core, one only has to take a look at the evening news to see that this assertion cannot possibly be true. For if people were truly good, they would not seek to harm others. They would not desire to have what does not belong to them, and eventually take it by any means available, tell lies to get what they want, or disrespect their parents. Additionally, if mankind is really good and pure at heart, then we might expect that everyone would be treated with the same level of respect. Though there are many notable female Buddhists, for Buddhism, equal treatment is simply not true. This is clearly seen from a statement made by Gautama Buddha, Buddhism's founder.
It is impossible that a woman should be the perfectly, rightfully enlightened one.
While women can definitely be Buddhists, it seems difficult, if not impossible, for them to be fully enlightened. There are two schools within Buddhism called the Theravada and the Mahayana. The Mahayana sutras, like the Pali Canon literature, maintain that a woman can become enlightened, but not in female form. For example, the Bodhisattva Humi, dated to the 4th century, states that a woman about to attain enlightenment will be reborn in the male form, according to Miranda Shaw.
This belief had negative implications for women insofar as it communicated the insufficiency of the female body as a locus of enlightenment.
Let us also discuss how we can know that we still have the original teachings of Buddhism. For anyone considering Buddhism as a spiritual practice, this is an important point to consider, as Buddhism freely admits that it cannot know with certainty whether it has the original teachings voiced by its founder, since a system of writing did not exist in India at the time that the Buddha lived. It is traditionally held that the original teachings were transmitted to the Buddha's first disciples by himself, then were passed on orally for many centuries before finally being written down.
We have lots of visual narratives and artwork from all over Buddhist Asia. But the first written material, actually, the first biography, say, of the Buddha, really, we don't see that before about 500 years after his death. For the first few centuries, Buddhist narrative was oral.
As Landau, Bodian, and Buneman tell us.
Writing wasn't in use at the Buddha's time. Because the earliest Buddhist texts were orally transmitted and written down only many centuries after the Buddha's death, scholars aren't certain about what the Buddha himself taught and what was later ascribed to him.
In addition to the discourses memorized during the founder's lifetime and recorded after his death, numerous other scriptures emerged centuries later that were attributed to him.
In this documentary, you have sometimes heard me refer to the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. Many people refer to him as Shakyamuni Buddha, but Shakyamuni Buddha is not the actual name of the Buddha. Shakya is the clan from which the Buddha came, and Muni means sage, while Buddha means enlightened. So corporately, the name Shakyamuni Buddha means the enlightened sage of the Shakya clan. He was born Siddhartha Gautama in between modern-day India and Nepal. According to the legend of how Shakyamuni Buddha came to be enlightened, he was a prince whose father had gone to great lengths to protect him from the reality of common life and the reality of suffering and death. Siddhartha grew up in a life of luxury and married at a young age and had a child. Soon, Siddhartha wanted to venture outside the palace, and his father finally allowed him to go out with a guide. Along the way, Siddhartha and his guide encounter a sick man. Though this wasn't entirely new to him, Siddhartha saw sickness as a bad thing and realized that this could happen to him at any moment. Next, Siddhartha notices an old man well advanced in years and realized that this too might happen to him. Still, Siddhartha notices a funeral and understands that he too will die. Knowing that an attachment to palace life and family life would prevent him from finding the answers which he sought, Siddhartha eventually leaves his life in the palace and his wife and son and ventures out into the woods to find the meaning of all the bad things in the world. Once there, he shaves his head, removes his robes, and dresses more modestly as an outward sign that he is no longer interested in a worldly life. Siddhartha begins his quest by listening to and following the teachings of local ascetics, who tell him that one must focus more on the spiritual practices and less on the body to understand what life is really all about. Before long, Siddhartha has mastered the practices of asceticism and is going without food and water for longer and longer periods of time until his body is just skin and bones. He sleeps on beds of nails, sleeps in the rain, does not bathe, and meditates almost constantly. At some point, he is near death because he has been undernourished. But a young girl comes along and offers him a bowl of rice, and he suddenly realizes that all of his ascetic practices did not free him from pain and suffering and dissatisfaction, but only increased it. Having eaten the rice and regained his strength, he bathes and dresses in clean clothes and leaves the other ascetics who believe that he has given up his spiritual journey. Siddhartha then determines that he will sit under a Bodhi tree until he finally reaches a state of enlightenment about how to end pain, suffering, and dissatisfaction. Mara, the ruler of the realm of desire within the human mind, comes to Siddhartha and tempts him with every imaginable temptation, but Siddhartha resists them all. When Siddhartha faces Mara, he is actually facing himself and his own desires and wants and attachments. The Lord of Desire had one final test for Siddhartha. He demanded to know who would testify on Siddhartha's behalf that he was worthy of attaining ultimate wisdom or enlightenment. Siddhartha touches the earth, and the earth quakes in response. Mara, the tempter, leaves because it is at this moment that Siddhartha has become enlightened by realizing that he is one with the earth and with all things, and therefore it is illogical to be attached to the things of life, since they cannot bring lasting joy, peace, and happiness, as only understanding this oneness with the earth and all things can. This proves his enlightenment or understanding about reality, and Mara is defeated as a result. Siddhartha meditates throughout the night and all of his former lives as insects, animals, and humans, male and female, are remembered by him, and he realizes that the process of birth, death, and rebirth, which he experienced in them all, were ultimately leading up to this particular moment of enlightenment. In other words, his past lives were all lived by him so that he could finally come to this moment of realizing that he is one with all things, and in doing so, he could be at peace with the process of birth, death, and rebirth, which had brought him to this point. Another way to describe it is to say that from his perspective, death should not be feared because in death you do not lose anything since you are one with all things. So, to conclude on this matter, the Buddha received his teaching from what he saw as an enlightened moment. As such, it is difficult to measure this account against reality, especially since Siddhartha had this moment of enlightenment directly after denying himself of sufficient food and water for a prolonged period of time. One has to wonder how that would affect a person's ability to think clearly and rationally. So I leave the viewer to decide for his or herself as to whether or not they are one with everything and everyone, or whether they are in fact completely separate from the things which they touch, taste, smell, see, and hear. If one believes all that Buddhism teaches, he or she can expect to one day die and finally break the cycle of birth and rebirth, and lose consciousness and awareness of everything forever. In other words, you can expect to disappear and more or less stop existing. That's what Buddhism holds out to its followers. It seems extremely difficult to prove whether a person could actually become one with all things after they died, simply because they believed that during this life they had no individual identity, and then tried to do some good things. This is the problem which we encounter when we study Buddhism's teachings and attempt to determine if they are true, since the Buddha never claimed to have done anything other than become enlightened. It seems to be his word against yours, mine, and anybody else who would demand measurable evidence. The Buddhist texts speak of no miracles or events which can be tested against hard evidence. However, since it could be said that while evolution does not necessarily propagate Buddhism, and most atheists could care less about Buddhism, the teachings of Buddhism rest heavily upon evolution as a basis for justifying its belief system. This is why we should take some time to examine evolution. It can be said that from the Buddhist perspective, modern man would have evolved to be just as intelligent as he is capable of being today, about 100,000 years ago, because this is what evolution teaches. However, what we find is that even evolution admits all of recorded human history only dates back to about 5,000 years ago. There is quite a large difference between 100,000 years and 5,000 years, and one has to wonder why in 100,000 years humans have not been able to become more technologically advanced, since in the last 150 to 200 years or so, humans have increased their learning and technology at a steadily accelerated rate. Given 100,000 years, and considering what we have accomplished in about 200 of the 5,000 recorded years, we should have been able to accomplish much more than we have. While an age of about 5,000 years for all of recorded human history would perfectly support the claims of other religions, it presents a huge problem for the Buddhist. Languages, writing, architecture, and human history should be much older, according to the Buddhist. Additionally, since the Buddhist believes that man evolved over time, this means that there would have to be a time when man was not a man, but some completely different creature with a very different DNA structure. The obvious problem with this scenario is that in order for one kind of creature to become another, its DNA must spontaneously generate extra information, which it did not contain before from some place outside of itself. Yet, this same requirement has never been observed by any evolutionist. A prominent evolutionist named Richard Dawkins was asked about this very topic, and here's what he had to say.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Can you just stop one?
When we are talking about one kind of animal changing into a completely different kind, we must also talk about vestigial organs. A vestigial organ is said to be an organ which is a vestige or a remaining part of an organ which the body no longer uses today, but used in the past at some point. In evolution, an organ only evolves if it is beneficial to the organism. According to evolutionary thought, an organ which does not function is not needed because it is not beneficial. This is why many people believe that the tailbone in the human body is leftover or a vestige from a tail which we once had as an ape-like creature. The reality is that some very important muscles are actually attached to the human tailbone, without which you would not be able to do some very important things. One only has to think about what is located in or near that part of your body, and you will begin to get a very good idea of what is connected to your tailbone and why your tailbone is needed. But if we want to insist that certain parts of the body evolved, we could easily consider the human eye. An eye, for example, cannot evolve, because all of the individual parts of the eye must all be present and functioning together at the same time, in order for the organ to be beneficial to the organism, and therefore needed. For an eye to evolve, there had to be a time when it did not exist. Then, there would have to be a time when it could not be used because all of the parts were not yet present or fully formed in order for the eye to be used. This is the point where evolution would stop as soon as it had started, because the eye or other body part was not beneficial to the organism because it was not even operational and fully formed yet. According to evolution, an organ which is not fully formed is not operational, and if it is not operational or beneficial, it must be discarded. Another problem which the Buddhist encounters is that nothing cannot create something, and no observable matter today has come into being by its own power. Another problem which the Buddhist encounters is that nothing cannot create something, and no observable matter today has come into being by its own power. Today, we walk around in our world and do not ever observe matter just spontaneously appearing from out of nowhere. We cannot create matter or destroy it. Matter cannot create or destroy itself. Therefore, matter must rely on a force much greater than itself and outside of itself to either be created or destroyed. Buddhism also relies not only on biological evolution, but cosmic evolution, or the evolution of planets and stars. The problem here is that evolution teaches that stars take millions of years to change from a red giant to a white dwarf star. Even though this is taught all over the world in public schools, the reality is that around 150 AD, the Greek astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, the Roman orator Cicero, and Roman general Germanicus had described Sirius as being a deeper red than Mars. Today, it is a white star. Another thing to consider is that in cosmic evolution it is said that Earth would have started out as having a molten surface, extremely hot, and gradually cooling over billions of years, as hydrogen evolved into other elements, and eventually water was formed and rained on the planet, cooling it off. This view of the Earth's evolution would suggest that all rock was once molten at some point in the past. However, when one carefully considers granite, the view of a molten Earth gradually cooling breaks down dramatically due to the presence of an element found within granite known as polonium-218. Polonium-218 can only exist in a molten rock for about 3 minutes before completely decaying and disappearing forever. Additionally, polonium-218 is produced as its parent polonium elements decay through a process. This process of decay leaves behind rings, which can be observed under a powerful microscope within the rock. The outer rings represent what was once the parent polonium material, which then later decayed and became a different version within the polonium family. Many times, this decay chain associated with polonium-218 is not present within granite, which is a huge problem for evolution, since polonium decays through different stages. One then has to offer up an answer as to how the polonium-218 came to be in the granites without its earlier versions also being present. A way to illustrate this complex concept is to imagine yourself in the refrigerated section of your local supermarket, standing in front of a shelf containing eggs. When we go shopping and see something like this, logic tells us that the eggs did not just appear on the shelf from nowhere, but they had to have come from somewhere. It is the same with polonium-218. Just as the egg came from a hen, polonium-218 came from earlier elements of polonium as they decayed through the process I mentioned earlier. The problem again is that polonium-218 cannot exist in molten rock for more than 3 minutes, but it supposedly took molten granite millions of years to cool. The polonium-218 found in the granite today should not exist if granite was a molten rock, but it does exist. As we have discovered so far, Buddhism holds to the idea that man does not have a soul. God does not exist. Man is his own God. Man needs to realize that he does not really exist as an individual, and the meaning of life is to someday disappear, so that suffering and dissatisfaction will no longer be experienced. According to Buddhism, the final goal of man is to be lost in everything and lose his consciousness and awareness as he becomes one with all things. The Buddhist reaches this goal through meditation and training the mind to accept the idea that there is no self, while putting forth effort to do good things for others in order to reach that goal of nirvana. As far as I have been able to discover, Buddhism has really only one teaching which could be considered prophetic, and it is that of a figure called Maitreya. Maitreya Buddha is more or less the Buddhist concept of a world savior, except that Maitreya does not come into the world to forgive sins, but to bring a balance to humanity and usher in an age of peace and prosperity during the darkest and ugliest times of war, disease, famine, and evil that the world has ever seen. In the Star Wars films, George Lucas modeled Anakin Skywalker as that Maitreya figure who failed to detach himself from Padme, who dies in childbirth, just as the Buddha's mother was said to have died shortly after the Buddha's birth. After Padme's death, Anakin later becomes Darth Vader, as a result of his anger and frustration concerning Padme's death, while his son Luke Skywalker becomes someone who more closely represents the Maitreya Buddha, one who battles evil and saves humanity because he is detached and focused on his spiritual lessons. The prophecy about Maitreya Buddha is still future-oriented, so at this time it is impossible to verify it. Before I move on to the next section concerning Hinduism, I want the viewer to take a moment to reflect on what we have learned so far. In considering Buddhism's teaching that there is no self and no eternal personage within us, it becomes clear that there can be no afterlife once one has achieved Buddhism's goal of complete enlightenment and nirvana. The obvious result is that if or when you reach nirvana, you cease to exist consciously. Since this would be true, things like the joy of relationships, friendships and family, music, a beautiful sunset, delicious food, and many other things can no longer be enjoyed either. Can you, as the viewer of this film, really embrace a system of thought which seeks to eliminate all of the good things in life, along with the bad? Are you willing to gamble your future on a belief which says that you are not really important as an individual who is different and unique? Are you willing to gamble your future on a belief which does not offer any guarantee that it is correct in the first instance? After all, no one wrote down the Buddha's own words during his life, and no one can communicate with Buddha to ask him if he reached nirvana. Therefore, there is no way to measure through scientific analysis if he indeed achieved nirvana in order that we might prove Buddhism's reliability. Consider these things as you continue to watch this film.